thank you everybody for coming. I know it is a lovely evening and I really do appreciate it. And actually this is a really special evening for me because I haven't been well this year, and so this is my first face-to-face talk since last year. So it's a real milestone for me. And so I have got some notes because I used to be able to do it just off pat without notes, but I'm afraid you'll have to excuse me having a few little notes as a reminder just to help me get through. But it's a real pleasure to be here, and I love the work that's being done here, and I think it's so important. So it's a real pleasure to remain president of the SMLC. It's just perfect, thank you. Okay, so I really want to talk to you, obviously, about AI, and I want to tell you a little bit about what AI is, and particularly what it has to do with education, but also how artificial and human intelligence are different, because that's really important. And it's important, I think, particularly when it comes to education. I'll talk for a while, as Ian has said. I'll take questions. If you want to interrupt me, feel free. If it gets too out of kilter, I'll come back to it, but let's keep this as informal as possible, because I think that's what's really important. Because for me, I just want people to want to understand more about AI. That's kind of my mission, and I think that has to start with education. And one of the challenges that somebody like myself faces is, how do I persuade incredibly busy teachers to give me a little bit of their time to try and persuade them that AI is something that they should prioritise, because they don't really have any time, and how can I persuade them that it's something that's urgent and important and they need to prioritise it? And so I'm going to really try and enthuse you about AI and tell you about the benefits, but I am also towards the end going to tell you about the scarier side, and then I'm going to say to you, should I do the enthusiasm? Should I do the scariness? What's the best way to get people to really think, oh, I really should be looking into this? Because I don't know what the best way is, so that would be really good, helpful to me to get your feedback on that. So firstly, what is AI? Well, you know, academics such as myself, well, not actually, I'm not an academic who would do this, but there are many who would spend weeks and months and years debating the best definition of artificial intelligence. But really, for practical purposes, I think it's perfectly fine to think about artificial intelligence as a technology that can behave in ways that, were we to see a human behaving in that way, we would think that's intelligent. So it's really technology that behaves intelligently, and it's fine to think of it like that. There are many, many more complex definitions than that, but honestly, at the heart of it, that's what it is. And the fact that we define AI in comparison to humans tells you something quite important. And that's because, of course, we have developed AI in our image, if you like. And so the big focus on AI has been on the aspects of our own intelligence that we particularly prioritize, the ones we like to measure. So, you know, way back when IBM built Deep Blue, the chess-playing computer that beats the then world champion Garry Kasparov, that was it. I can remember I was studying AI at the time, and I can remember people in my computer science department saying, that's it, hey, this is great. You know, we've built intelligent technology. And then within a year, the people who were looking at building systems who could see were going, gosh, this is so much harder than building systems that can play chess. And really, I don't think we've thought of that as part of our intelligence. Of course, it is part of our intelligence, and there's so much more. So we do think that's a really important part. But in terms of what is AI, I want to differentiate between two different types of AI, and I'll explain why when I've told you about the two different types. So there's the kind of old-fashioned AI, which is what existed from about 1956, and that's very much a system of rules, if you like. So if you build a good old-fashioned AI system, as it's called, or GoFi as the acronym, this is a system that operates mainly on a set of rules. And so you need a programmer to write the code to make those rules fire, and then you have a system. But you can't, that system won't change. So if I've got a system that's designed, say, to decide whether somebody should be given a bank loan, or whether a set of symptoms mean that there's a particular diagnosis. My bank loan system or my diagnostic system is not going to learn as our views about what good lending decisions are, or actually the right symptoms to diagnose something change. That system's not going to learn because it's hardwired in the code in the system. So that's a huge disadvantage of the older methods of AI, is that they can't learn, they can't update themselves. Now, more modern AI, which comes under the umbrella term of machine learning, can learn, hence the name machine learning. And that modern AI that uses machine learning learns from experience, just as we do. I mean, the students here learn from their experiences here, at home, in their lives, just as I do. We're all still learning. And so machine learning learns from its experience. But for machine learning, that experience is in the form of data. So if I wanted to build a machine learning system to pick Ian out from a crowd, to recognise Ian's face, he's wandering around in Brighton, but the system's going to say, oh yes, there's Ian Cunningham. Then you could show the system, or you would give the system data for millions and millions and millions of pictures of people, and every time it picked Ian, you would reward the system. Actually, a bit like we do often with learners, you would reward the system, so then it would be more likely to pick that image of Ian, and sometimes you'd be looking this, sometimes that way, sometimes that, and gradually the system would learn. Now, I am oversimplifying because there are different forms of machine learning, but my point is machine learning learns from data and is able to go on learning. As it's fed more data, it learns more. So, for example, with my example of recognising Ian, say Ian was in a particular posture that he'd never been in before and never been pictured before, the system would learn that that's still Ian, even though he's got his head through his legs or whatever it is you're doing and that makes you hard to recognise. You see what I mean? It can improve. And that's really important. And at this point you might be thinking, well, why would we want the old-fashioned stuff at all? Because if we've now got this stuff that learns, surely we don't need the old stuff. And to an extent, that's true, but the problem with machine learning as a form of AI is that it's very hard to understand the decisions that the system has made. It's not transparent. It's what's called black box. If you think of a set of rules that are fired, you can look through the rules and see why a decision has been made. It's much more transparent in that old-fashioned system. And in fact, those systems, in fact, they still exist. Those systems can explain, well, we've made this decision because of X, Y, Z. That's not the case with machine learning. So it is still important to understand that there are two different types. And it's not just that we can just do everything AI using machine learning. And there's a whole area of study now called explainable AI that's trying to make it possible for us to take advantage of what machine learning can do, but sometimes combining it with some older techniques in order to try and make sure you also get an explanation. So I think it's quite important to understand that. But let's get to education, because that's what really, really matters. So what can AI technology, whatever type of technology it is, let's not worry whether it's old-fashioned or machine learning, let's just say it's AI. What can it do in schools, colleges, universities, for learners? Well, one of the very powerful things about AI, and this is particularly strong with machine learning AI, is that an AI system can adapt. So imagine that I have students who are struggling to understand quadratic equations. I know I did. So we have our students and we have an AI system that is there to tutor, not teach. I want to separate those two things, but to tutor those students. So the AI software will have the student completing problems, and as the student completes problems, the AI system will make decisions about how to adapt, say, the difficulty of the equation or the support and hints and tips that the system provides on the basis of what that student has done and on the basis of what that AI system has learned from the millions of students that it's probably had been trained on, and then some that it's experienced in the last few hours, last few days, last few months. So that means that you have a system that's constantly improving in its ability to adapt to what an individual learner needs. Now, obviously, there's limits on what it can adapt. It's only got a certain set of things it can do, but they're very, very useful. And well-designed systems of that nature are actually really effective. They're never as effective as a one-to-one human teaching another human, but let's face it, how many students get that? So they can be tremendously useful for helping students, whether it's about remediation or whether it's just being able to differentiate between different needs very easily. I think of AI, if we get it right in education, as being a teacher's superpower. It's about giving teachers superpower, giving them more eyes in the back of their head, more skills, more abilities. Certainly not about replacing them. But then you can also get AI systems that can make recommendations. So, as you'll know, there are many online retailers, and you get little messages saying, oh, people who bought this also bought that, or you've bought this, you might like that. I find most of these deeply irritating, because I buy an umbrella and then I get 10 sorts of umbrella shapes. No, I've bought the umbrella, I don't want another umbrella, you know?
I'll go.
Not very intelligent AI, but you know, there are more versions that are more intelligent. And so there's some good systems in education that will recommend resources for teachers that are the most suitable for that teacher's needs or for students. And there's quite a lot of those out there. Now, we were talking earlier about Century Tech. So Century Tech is a product that you're using in your college, and maybe something being used elsewhere. And that's definitely a product that fits in that first category of adapting. So, but what's interesting about Century Tech is that it covers all different aspects of the curriculum. So it's not just a maths tutor, it covers the curriculum that your students are taking. And then it provides feedback to teachers, which is really helpful, as we were discussing earlier, and helps you understand a student's strengths and weaknesses. And then you get what I think's the real beauty when it's done well, is you as the human expert know precisely where to focus your time and attention, because the AI has given you very useful feedback. As well as supporting the student to learn, it's also giving you information about that student that means you can really pinpoint where you give your support. So that's really helpful. And there are lots of systems out there that provide adaptive instruction. You do have to be a little bit careful, because whilst Century is absolutely an AI system, some systems claim to be AI and they're not AI, and that's another reason why people need to understand a bit about AI, so you can ask the right questions and make sure it's the real deal and it's not pretending to be something that it's not. I think the real power of AI comes when you start to combine the capabilities of artificial intelligence. So I've talked about it can adapt, it can also recommend, but that's sort of another version of being able to adapt. We can also sense. So I wear this device because I like running. And so this is collecting data about my heart rate, it's collecting data about my respiration, my VO2 max. For anybody else who's a running, or always, oh, what's my VO2 max? You know, it's given me lots of data about my physical capabilities, and also about my sleep and my body battery, and goodness knows what. And that's sensing. Now, there's a limited amount of AI in this device, but if you think about devices that sense, so that could also be cameras that recognise Ian's face as being Ian, but also maybe see if you're smiling, can look at your furrowed brow. It's not furrowed at the moment, but perhaps it was, and think, is he confused? So if you think about sensing and the data that we collect from sensing being analysed by AI algorithms, so that gives me my feedback that tells me, you need longer recovery time today, Rose, because actually you overdid it a bit with that run, or you're really not doing well, you need to do more tomorrow. Then we can start to see how that sensing combined with that adaptivity means that we can start to address the whole learner. So we can start to think about their social, their emotional well-being, as well as, well, are they understanding maths or geography? Is their confidence growing? Do they persevere? What's going on here? So once you start to combine that sensing with adaptivity, then you start to get some really powerful possibilities. And so there's a little product, I'll use a different example for very, very young infants called Otto, developed by a company called Oya Labs. That is a sensing device shaped like a cloud with a sun that sits in a baby's room and just captures the sounds and then uses some AI techniques to analyse those sounds, and then through a phone app provide feedback to the parents, carers, to say how they can do more to help their child's language development, so how they can interact with that infant. Now, I have a little discomfort with that particular example, but I use it quite deliberately because I think it shows how we need to think carefully. But you can see how that would happen as people are interacting with an infant, making noises, not making noises, as the infant's responding, then this data is collected and advice is given back. And then the final example, going to another extreme of age, is a university system that's used in the University of California. It's called SimSensei, that's SENSEI, and it's a counselling system for students. And so you have on the screen an on-screen character, and you might call avatar, it happens to usually be a lady sitting in a chair, who is interacting, talking to the student. So the student is speaking and the AI is analysing the speech, and the SimSensei counsellor is responding on the basis of what that student is saying, and the AI system is producing results for that on-screen character that they can feed back to the student, so you're having a conversation. But additionally, the system is also doing facial analysis. So the system is also looking to see if the student is looking anxious. It's also analysing the student's speech, not just for what they're saying, but for the way they're saying it, and for the gaps, for the speed, for all of the different factors of speech that are known to be associated with different psychological states. And that's also fed into the AI system that then helps that on-screen avatar provide the feedback to the student that the system considers to be optimal. Again, you can have a think about how comfortable you do or don't feel with that. The point I'm making is that the combination of being able to collect data not just from a student typing something into a keyboard, but from their behaviour, passively, if you like, in the background, really empowers these systems. And that can be hugely beneficial for education. There's huge, huge, huge potential there. Now, I personally think potential there is about much of that data being given to human teachers rather than an on-screen character. I think, again, thinking about AI as a teacher's superpower, I would be, as an educator myself, and I not just teach in higher education, I've taught in further education before and even in schools, I know that had I, as an educator, been able to access the level of analysis from this detailed spectrum of lots and lots of information about students, when they're with me, when they're not with me, I could have really pinpointed the support I was giving them. I mean, you know, as educators, a number of times you stand there and think, oh, if only I really knew what you didn't understand, I'm sure I could help here, or if I knew what was going on there. And so I personally think rather than feeding to an on-screen character, it's about feeding to the human teacher. And that's possible too. But this is about what's out there and what the possibilities are. And as I say, some of them make us feel more uncomfortable than others. And it's important that we recognise that feeling of discomfort. But how can we leverage this? So we have this smart technology, it's being developed all the time. There are more and more companies who are supplying educational establishments, parents, families with AI technology that is labelled as being to help learning, let's say, to help teaching. But how can educators make sure that they and learners are the winners in this? Because there will be winners and losers, I'm afraid. I wish it wasn't the case, but it is. And if you look at the social media world and the big tech companies, not necessarily in education. You only have to look at the power and the money that those companies have made to realise where the winners sit there. And I would be horrified to think that would happen in education. So I think it's really important that all of us, but particularly educators, understand enough about AI to make the right decisions about how AI is going to be used by them, by their students, by their family. That's what my mission is. It's not that I want everybody to be able to build an AI system, particularly not about making sure everybody can code. And this is quite a controversial area. There are certainly many people who disagree with me about whether people need to learn to write program code in order to understand artificial intelligence. And my argument is that you don't, because you can understand a great deal about artificial intelligence without ever writing a line of code. Now, I love coding. It's not that I don't want people to code. It's not that I've got some objection to it. It's just that it's not the be-all and end-all. And I worry about it because more and more AI systems are able to automate the writing of the code. Because the difficult bit is deciding what the problem is, how you unpack the problem, and what kind of a system, what you want that system to do. So you want to build an AI system, but you need to really understand the problem you're trying to address first, and then what actions you want your system to be able to take. When you get to the level of writing the code, that's the easy bit. That's the bit you can automate. Maybe easy is the wrong word. Because program coding isn't easy, but it's a very tightly well-defined activity. Therefore, you can automate it. And what worries me about the focus on code is that we will have everybody getting to be good at the things that we can then automate. And that's just so the wrong way to go. We want to make sure we focus on helping humans do the things that we can't automate. So I want people to understand AI without feeling that they have to code. Now, if you want to go off and code afterwards, great. It's great fun if you like that kind of thing. But it's not essential for understanding AI. Yes,
if you're
please do.
Students at a lower age group and you want them to understand like decomposition and abstraction, that's far more important than basic text-based programming.
Yes, but I would say that's computational thinking, and I agree with you. That's so. I think computational thinking is important, and that involves that problem deconstruction. When I studied AI originally as an undergraduate, admittedly as a mature student, but even then, it was very much about understanding the problem, understanding how you broke the problem up, and then understanding how you might go about solving the problem. I think we've got, because the sophistication of the AI techniques that have now been developed, particularly in machine learning and in areas such as neural networks, which is, sorry to use a technical term, but it's an area of machine learning. We've built some amazing systems, and we've kind of got very, very focused on the nitty-gritty at the lowest level of building those systems, which of course is important, but it's not the whole thing. And we sometimes forget the importance of that. You use the word abstraction, but that abstraction of what is the real problem and what are we trying to do with it. So, and I'm happy to come back and talk about that more if that's helpful. And that's why the focus of this book, and I've got a copy for everybody, which I'm just going to give you. You don't have to buy it, I'm giving it to you. We just went on this mission to try and help more people understand AI. What we're trying to do is help educators get inside machine learning AI in particular. We do talk about old-fashioned AI, but I want people to understand what the AI is trying to do, what the AI is capable of doing, and what it cannot do. So it doesn't talk about any writing of code. What it does talk about is some of the techniques. It tries to be non-technical, but I admit there are the words unsupervised machine learning in there. There is some feature extraction in there. This is some technical terms, but we explain them very carefully. And this is to try and help people understand what the AI is capable of doing. But we want to do it in a way that focuses on the kind of real challenges that educators, parents, learners face. So I was very lucky in this book was written in collaboration with somebody called Karine George, who is an award-winning primary school head teacher, who would be the first to say that she is not a techie. She, one of the top universities in the world, is a very particular kind of teaching. It's not the majority. It's not what the majority of teaching is about. It's important and it's very enjoyable, but we wanted to make sure this was accessible. You can make your own decisions about whether we succeeded. I expect we need to do more work. Usually we do, but it's very much at that level. So it's trying to think about problems like recruiting staff, for example, or attainment gaps. Do you have a particular gender-based issue with maths attainment, for example, or not? You might not. It could be about pupil attendance and why pupils are attending or why they're always late. It could be about so many different things. It could be about wanting to understand whether your marking and feedback really is helping students to learn or not. There's so many challenges that we face as educators, and one of the challenges I think a lot of people faced during the pandemic restrictions was, are we providing the same quality of education using all of this remote technology? Is there consistency? Is it high quality? Or are we providing a good education? We kind of knew what we were doing when we were doing it more face to face. And so that's a problem that we use in the book to try and explain how AI could help you to tackle that problem, to try and understand that challenge. And then you think about, well, okay, what could AI do to help us actually understand that and understand how we can constantly, reliably monitor the quality of the education that we're providing. And so the book takes you through 7 steps. It's really important that I explain that those 7 steps are the precursor to knowing how to use AI in education. So it's not a step guide to say how you might develop your AI strategy, although I can say something about that and we'll try to. Remind me if I don't at the end and you want an answer to that. It's very much about where you need to be in your understanding in order to make the right decisions about how AI is going to help you. Because I worry that most educational budgets are fairly scarce, and if you're going to invest some of that very precious budget in some AI, it damn well ought to be the one that's going to work for you, not the one the supplier tells you you want, but the one that's actually doing what you need. Now, of course, you're probably all using AI anyway, because if you're using speech to text, I use it all the time to remind myself of things. I speak into my phone, and it does exactly. That's AI. Now we're back traveling again. If you use a navigation system, that's AI. So we are all using AI, but I think it's really important for education that we look very carefully at the implications of AI for education and try to understand it in a way that will help us make the right decisions, because it's really important we do make the right decisions when it comes to AI in education. I've already referred to the large tech companies and my concerns about the way that they operate. I think we have to be careful that we don't end up with an education system that's dominated by profit-making, to be in the technology provided rather than what's actually good for the students. We're not there at the moment. I'm not saying that, but I'm saying there is a risk and we need to be aware of it. So the 7 steps are very simple, and they are represented by the acronym ethical, because being ethical is the most important thing. So let's have it as the acronym. That way we remember it. So the E is about enthusing people. If I was a school leader and I wanted to engage the school in developing an AI strategy, for example, I would first of all want to enthuse them about why on earth they might want to do that. What would be the benefit of doing that? So the first step is to enthuse people by trying to show how AI could help with a challenge that they are facing. There are some really nice AI courses available freely, and I can recommend some if people are interested. But they're all abstracted, and what this is about is to try and provide a contextualized understanding of AI, contextualized within an educational setting. So things like, I'm going on a trip. Well, a good old-fashioned AI system could really help with that. Repeated process, what do I need to do? I was looking that you're organising a ball, and I was thinking, organising events, taking trips, there's a whole set of steps that you generally do. That's a great thing for an AI system, so that's an example. And so understanding how an AI program might operate to produce such a system starts to help you understand what AI can do, what AI can't do. So as I say, the point is to try and help educators get inside what's happening with the AI. And so the second step in the framework, the T is tailor and hone, i.e. what's your challenge? What's the biggest challenge you're facing at the moment for your school, for your learners, for you as a teacher, for you as a parent? What's that biggest challenge? And then we provide some prompts to try and help identify what a challenge might be, and we provide a sort of 10-step framework to help people decide which of the challenges, because there won't just be one, which of the multiple challenges you're facing is the one that would be the most suitable to go through the next steps with, because it's the one that's most amenable to AI. And so that means helping people to understand the difference between human intelligence and artificial intelligence. And because you don't want to pick a challenge that actually would be much better done by a human. You want to pick a challenge that's one that actually is accessible to an AI solution. And then we start looking at that challenge. And step 3, so we've got ET, T and H, tailor and hone. The I is to identify and collate the data that you already have available to you. And this is to try and help educators get into the mindset that anybody who is building an AI system is fed by data, if it's a machine learning AI system. So if you start to look at your data about this challenge, then you can start understanding your challenge through that AI lens, because you can start looking at the data. And one of the things that we try and highlight is that not all of the data that's available to you is necessarily obvious as being associated with an educational challenge. So often in schools, there's data about temperature, there's data about noise levels, there's data about light levels, as well as all the data about who scored what in a particular test or a particular assessment. There'll be attendance data, there could even be data about movement of people around the building, when it's congested, when it's not congested. There's often historical data that people forget they have, or data that someone in the school knows is being collected, but not everybody does. So for example, and it was actually with Karine, the co-author of this book, I was giving a talk and was talking about how useful it could be if you had some recordings of an interaction in a classroom, to just very simply analyse how much time is the teacher talking and how much time are the students talking. And Karen said, oh, but we've got some technology that just records. I never thought. We've got that data. We've got a system in place that's there for recording lessons for teacher CPD. I said, well, there you go then. You've got that video data. That's an ingredient that you could use. So it's about trying to help educators think really broadly and widely about what data exists in their environment and how that might be relevant to their challenge, because that's how an AI company would look at it. And so it is, in a sense, we're trying to help you know how you build an AI system, but not at the level of coding, at the level of that more abstracted, at the level of what's the problem and how can we solve it. And the ingredient that helps us is the data. And so then we've done the I, and we're now on the C, ethic, is collect data. So generally we find there's a piece of data that you don't necessarily have. So to give you a very specific example, it's not in a school context and it's a work-based learning context. We did a piece of work with a training company in the financial services sector who came to me many years ago and said, we've got a problem. We spend 6 months and a lot of money training graduates, and third of them leave within 3 months of going into the workplace. We must be doing something wrong. We would like an AI bot to work alongside our simulated environment that we use for learning. I said, why do you want an AI bot? We never did build an AI bot, I want to say. Why do you want an AI bot? Oh, well, there must be something wrong with the training because they're not coping when they get to the workplace. To cut a long story short, it wasn't actually anything to do with the training specifically. It was actually to do with the fact that the thing that the organisation thought they knew without any question at all was the answer to the question, what makes a good employee in your organisation? And we kept asking this, kept saying, no, we know that. We've been doing this for years, we know that. It's like, yeah, you've been doing it for years and you're losing a third. Maybe this is something worth investigating. And we looked into this and we had lots of historical data because they had videos from interviews and they had lots of performance data. So we were able to use all of that data to actually pull out some profiles of, look, here are the type of the people that are doing really well in this part of your business. Here are the people who are doing really well in that part of your business. This might actually help you with your training and your recruitment. But they didn't have any data about personality traits. So the extra data, the C collect that we collected, was we got some past and present employees to complete a personality questionnaire. Very simple piece of data collection, but it made a big difference. And when we looked at the data, the historical data, and we looked at it in comparison with that data from the personality trait survey, it was really interesting how it all fitted together. But that personality data added that extra parameter. So you were able to say, look, the people who are staying in the workplace and who are doing particularly well in this area also tend to have these personality traits. And so we were able to create 4 different profiles to help the company make better decisions about where within the business people were placed, how they recruited, and how they trained. So that example, I just want to highlight that it was helping them use data they'd already got, but also helping them to collect that extra piece of data that gives you that extra thing for the problem, the challenge that you're trying to solve. So we've now done the C for collect, so ethic I. The next one is the A, which is about applying AI to the data. And of course, this is where it's very hard to explain without getting technical, because how do you know what AI to apply? You're not AI experts. How can I explain this to you? You've got a bunch of data, and I'm going to say, and we apply some AI techniques, and then you get this. That's not really going to help you understand what happens in that magic step of, well, let's just apply this AI, and then you'll get a nice result. So if I take that example of how do we know that we're providing a consistently good education when we get big disruptions, like having to deliver everything remotely, or then sometimes remotely and sometimes with people in physical presence, and some people physically and some people remotely. If we take that as an example and think about the kind of data that would definitely be available, and quite a limited set that you'd probably, I say definitely be available, highly likely to be available. You would likely have some performance metrics from your students before and during that. Old-fashioned assessment data, doesn't necessarily, it could be self-assessment data, whatever it is, but something that tells you about student performance. You are highly likely, if you're using some kind of system like a Zoom or some kind of system to support your remote interactions, you're highly likely to have some video data. You may even have the kind of video data that would enable you to have an AI system look at where students are looking, which is actually really important, because we know that if students are learning collaboratively, which many of them were when they were online, are they looking at the camera? Are they looking down? Are they in a small breakout room and they're looking at each other? If they're physically present, are they looking at the thing they're working on? Are they looking at each other? Are they doing this? Really easy data for AI to analyze, and you can start to get a little ingredient of analysis that can help you build a picture about, are the interactions that are going on the kinds of interactions that are likely to be successful or not. So you can have that kind of data as well. And you'll have obviously some basic attendance data. And what I would suggest is that you might then collect through a survey a data that perhaps looked at something like student confidence, student motivation. And that could be a student's view of themselves. It could also be a teacher's view. It could also be the teacher's view about how confident they felt when they were delivering remotely, or when they had some students in the class and some students not. So I'm just trying to pick some fairly basic data examples. There could be loads more, but you've got a mix there of data that you're likely to have. And what we would want to do with that is decide, okay, we've got this mix of data, what kind of AI do we apply? And this is where in the book, and I do it quite a lot giving talks, is I try and encourage people to think of this as being a bit like cooking. So think of that data as my ingredients. So I've got some video data, I've got some performance data, I've got some results from surveys, I've probably got some attendance data, various other pieces of data. Think of that as my ingredients. Now, generally, when you make a decision about what kind of cooking method you're going to use, is it going to be baking, frying, grilling, boiling? Quite a lot of that is dictated by the ingredients. Not all of it. It's usually a combination of the ingredients and what you want to produce. So we've got our data ingredients, and we want to produce something that's going to help us understand whether these interactions that our students and teachers had during the disruption of the pandemic were effective or not, basically. So we've got our ingredients, we know what we want to find. That's the basis on which we make the decision about what kind of AI we use. And I'll come back to that in just a second. So if we think about, I love cooking programs. And you would have watched ones, I'm sure, where you've got an individual cook, or perhaps a group of cooks, and there's a sheet on the table, and underneath it is ingredients, and they've got to go away and make a main course or a dessert using these ingredients. You whip off the cloth and say, for example, I've got some raspberries, some sugar. It's a very simple example of this. Raspberry, sugar, cream, eggs. Okay, so I look at that and I think, well, that's interesting. I don't think I'm going to be frying that, because I could kind of fry the eggs, maybe add some sugar. Not really, doesn't feel like that's going to be the way to go. I suppose there's an omelette in there somewhere, but a raspberry omelette doesn't really work, does it? And I may have been told that I need to produce a dessert anyway. But you can fairly quickly come down to think, I think I'm going to be baking here. And if I'm then told I need to produce a dessert, you can start thinking about, well, it could be a meringue, it could be a raspberry meringue or a raspberry pavlova, or it could be a souffle, a raspberry souffle. But they both need baking. And it's really similar with AI. So we have our ingredients, we have our data, we know we want to understand something about those interactions from that data that's going to help us know how effective we were when we had this disruption to deal with. And so for this example, we would use something called unsupervised machine learning. Now in the book, we go into detail, but I'm not going to try and do that tonight because it's too much for the session. But what I will say is unsupervised machine learning is not trained. So I used the example of getting a system to learn to recognize Ian in a crowd. And I said we would give that system millions of pictures of lots of people, including Ian, and every time it recognized Ian, we would give it a reward. That's supervised machine learning. You're training the system to produce a known result. There's also something called unsupervised machine learning, where you have an algorithm that looks at data and finds patterns in the data. So if we think about our data, about interactions, when students were learning remotely and sometimes face-to-face, sometimes mixed, we have a set of lessons, if you like, a set of interactions that make up lessons. And what we want to do is to find out what are the features of those lessons that appear to be, I will say most effective, but we'll unpack that a bit in a minute, because that might be about confidence building rather than performance, depending on what you want at that particular moment. But that's what we're doing. And so something like unsupervised machine learning helps you to extract from that huge amount of data patterns that you can then use to build profiles. So in the same way that I described when we had our 4 profiles of employees or non-employees, because some of them had left, but you know, here are the profiles of people that seem to fit well into these different aspects of your business, and here's how you could alter some of your processes in order to help them get to the right place in your business and therefore not leave. This is the same thing. We've got all this data and we want to be able to say, okay, so broadly we had a set of lessons that had these common features, a set that had these common features, a set that had these common features, and then we can look at that survey data and see, oh, okay, so actually this type of setting worked particularly well for students who are lacking in confidence. I'm using just an example. It might be something else you're interested in. But the point is you mix up the ingredients in the same way that you do with making your souffle or your pavlova, and you then use a method, but not a cooking method, an AI method, in this instance called unsupervised machine learning, and what you come out with is not a set of souffles, you come out with a set of descriptions of profiles of lessons that have common features. So, for example, it might be that lessons that were using group learning, small group learning, in a physical context where there were others learners learning remotely, but both groups had not just the remote learning system, but some additional technology that they were using. Maybe it was an iPad, maybe it was something else that they were using to learn with. It could have been, you know, some kind of voice activated assistant. So I'm talking and this is taking text of what I'm saying as I was talking earlier, and maybe they're using something like that. And that appears to have worked particularly well for this type of teacher, this type of learner. And then you'll get another profile that will have different features. Okay, for this lesson profile, it's mostly when people were learning online, they were all doing the same thing, they were only using the remote learning system, but they had a teacher who was very, very confident that she was delivering or he was delivering an effective lesson. And you can obviously see the results in the performance data, but you can also look at your survey and see, well, what kind of learner did that work for? So I hope that's making some sense to you. You can see how that is this kind of thing that AI can do. It can take that data and it can find patterns that humans are not capable of finding. You know, millions and millions and millions of data points. Now I have to also say that just like cooking, it's regularly the preparation, particularly with little desserts, that takes longer than the actual cooking. And this is true for AI as well. So because I've glossed over the fact that we've got very different sorts of data there. We've got some video data, we've got some performance data, we've got some attendance data. All of this data has to be what's called cleaned, which means we have to make sure it's accurate and then transformed so it's all in a similar style before you can apply your AI, and that takes 90% of the time. And the last 10% is when you actually apply the magic AI and then you get the output. But if you don't do that first bit, that 90% right, your output, you know, if I don't mix the sugar and my cream and I don't whip up the eggs, I'm not going to have a good souffle. Doesn't matter how good my oven is. And it's exactly the same. So a lot of work goes into the preparation, making sure you've got the right data and that it's been transformed and cleaned appropriately, and then that the right AI is applied to it to give you the result that you want. So that's trying to get you inside that AI lens to kind of understand what's happening when an AI is processing data. And the final step is about learning. So I said it was ethical. We have to learn from that. So yes, we've got our profiles. What can we learn from those profiles? What can we learn by looking at our survey data, looking at those profiles? Can we run the algorithm again with a different data set? Will we learn something different? Because once we've done it once, we can do it again. Unlike our baking, once we've turned our egg, sugar, cream and raspberries into a raspberry souffle, we can't undo it all again. with AI, you can take the ingredients again and run a different algorithm and find something else out. So it's powerful. It really is powerful. And there, of course, lies the tension. It's powerful. And if you're thinking about using data that is not intrusive in terms of its collection, but is reporting on people's physiology, emotional state, how they're speaking, very smart AI, you can get some very, very powerful results. And so to finish, I want to offer you this. Is it the excitement or is it the scariness? I think the excitement of AI is that it can be a superpower for teachers. It can help teachers be way more effective, and it can help learners be more effective as well, because of the way that modern AI can work with that data. And then old-fashioned AI can help us understand what that machine learning has done. But we get that data about what's gone on. As human teachers, we then make the smart decisions. And I really believe that AI could transform education for the better. And the reason I get out of bed every morning is because I think for the first time in the history of the world, we could actually give every child in the world a good education. And there are, how many is it now? 63 million children who won't get even a basic primary school education in the world. Sorry, it always does this. I get the hairs on the back of my neck, always stand up when I say this, because it's true. We have the technical knowledge. We could do it, but we have to make the right decisions now. And it means that educators need to be right at the top of the decisions that are made about how AI is used in education. Because of course the downside is that not everybody is purely interested in the best outcomes for the teachers and the learners. And so my final point is just a little story. I was having my coffee in the morning a month or so ago and listening to a podcast. And it was a Financial Times podcast. And it's called Tectonic. You can listen to it if you're interested. There are several parts to it. And this particular episode was telling the story. It's called the Clubman Story. And I'll explain why in just a moment. And it's a very sad story about a guy called Luca who was killed in a hit and run accident on the Branko Bridge in Belgrade in Serbia. And the police weren't bothered about finding, it was at night, there were no witnesses, they didn't think they got stand a chance of finding who the culprit was, so they weren't doing much. But Luca's father wouldn't give up. So he stood on the bridge every day protesting until the police started to look into it. And actually they did find some grainy CCTV footage, and they did manage to identify the driver, but they couldn't find the car. They identified the car, but they could not find the car in the country. But they circulated the picture of the driver, grainy as it was, to other police forces. And within 3 days, the Chinese had identified the driver and deported him back to Serbia. Win-win. The police find the criminal. Luca's father feels that his son's death, he's got an account, he knows who was responsible. Now the hairs are on their ends on the back of my neck again, because this is the nasty side of it. So of course, why could the police in China find this man so quickly? Because they have cameras everywhere. They know where everybody is, they know what everybody's doing. And so it won't surprise you to learn that Serbia is one of 64 countries, I think it is now, that has now bought that technology themselves. So the Branko Bridge in Belgrade in 2022 now has that face recognition technology that was used to find the driver who killed Luca. But here's the good bit. The facial recognition technology was not turned on because the public were engaged in a protest to say they did not want that technology used. Because of course the benefits are that the police can be effective in catching criminals. But you've got to look at the downside of that. And you can see what's been happening in China, with what's happened during the pandemic and knowing where people are, and it is Big Brother, there's no question about it. And so we have to be very careful. It just so happens, and this was a coincidence, and it's probably what makes me remember that podcast so much. The last conference I went to before lockdown was an event where I heard the head of technology for Huawei, who's one of the technology companies that produces the kind of facial recognition, not the only one, telling us about their amazing facial recognition technology and how they had perfected the aging process for facial recognition, so they could have a picture of me at 10 and they'd recognize me at 25. And the reason they were doing this was so that they could reunite lost children with parents. The speaker was dewy-eyed, there was music playing, there was a video of parents running to meet their lost children, and I was being told that Huawei were doing this in order to achieve that. Obviously rubbish. What worried me is when I turned around, the audience were all completely engaged with this. The point is that people who sell AI don't always tell you the downsides. Of course they promote the upsides, and that's why you need to be educated. Because although you may think, well, those examples they don't come from the educational world, and that's true, but I'm afraid there are examples in the education world where there are systems being used to monitor children's brain activity that is then used to differentiate students who should be supported by the system and students who shouldn't be supported by the system. We know now from a lot of very modern, very, very recent neuroscience that it is possible to know from brain activity, for example, whether somebody is trying to categorize an item. And so you might be looking at a student thinking they're looking out the window doing nothing, but actually they are thinking about what they've just been learning and they're categorizing it. Now, that's great, isn't it? And we could build an AI system that would pick up that brain data. And we have actually been talking about doing this. But for me, it would only be useful if it's fed it back to the learner, or possibly their teacher. Now, you imagine that being used in a less supportive manner within education, and you get the bad side. So tell me, are you more engaged by the negative, or are you more engaged by the positive? Because I don't know which way works best for people, but what I do know is we need to get engaged in this. And it is actually quite urgent, because AI is taking over, and you can see what's happening outside of education. It is coming into education. There is more investment in educational technology, particularly AI educational technology, this year than ever before. And it's increasing rapidly. There are very new investors investing in companies. And these investors know nothing about education. They don't give a toss about education. They give a toss about making money. And unless the company building that AI does care about education, then we end up in that negative situation. So it is really important. Sorry, I did the scary bit again. But I just want to make the point that there's huge potential, but if we don't recognize the negatives, we won't get the gold. And that means we have to understand enough to make sure that we choose the right AI and that we use it responsibly, and that we question anybody who's coming along claiming to sell us an AI system that's going to solve our problem. I really hope that's something that you've understood and that you've enjoyed. I talked for longer than I intended to. I thought I was going to talk for less than I intended to, so I'm sorry about that. But nobody was falling asleep, so I took that as a good sign.